Hi, I'm Emma Porter and I'm Managing Director at Story Contracting. We're a family owned business with four different divisions: rail, plant, Scotland, and construction. And I lead the construction division. I did psychology at university, which I think is a pretty useful degree for leadership, but which sometimes I feel like I would have more authority speaking at events like this if I'd done something like engineering. When I first started working in construction and when I was starting out in my career, I really didn't have any interest in being involved in women's networking or women's conferences. I felt like I didn't want any favoritism and I just wanted to beat the boys fair and square. But as I've progressed through my career and I see less and less women at leadership positions and less women at the table, and I learn more around some of the topics I'm going to talk about today and some of the topics being talked about at this conference, it makes me realize that events like this and networks like women's networks are not about favoritism. They're around understanding and removing some of the barriers that exist and make it not a fair race in the first place. You know, often I hear the argument that it has to be based on merit when as justification for not having a very diverse team. And I just think, of course, it has to be based on merit. And if it was based on merit, we wouldn't really need to have this conversation because we would just naturally see a diverse team emerging. The fact that we don't see very diverse teams often emerging at the top proves to me that there is something else going on other than just being purely based on merit. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died recently, I saw a quote online from her which said, "Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." And I really feel like that sums up my whole talk and is at the heart of how you can transform men into allies and bring people on board. I'd like to start off by saying that, you know, I like working with men. They're great, usually. This is not about women versus men. And I think if the conversation becomes that, women versus men, it just becomes divisive and counterproductive and really is almost certainly not going to convince the rest of your team that developing a diverse team would be a good thing. And yet diverse teams always have the potential to outperform homogenous ones. It has to be inclusive and diverse, but you know, I'm not really going to go in too much. I'm going to presume that this audience already knows that and I don't need to talk about it any more than that. Before I get onto the things I do want to talk about, I have a caveat, which is that I often don't know how to best handle this topic. It's hard to get right. It's especially hard when it's pre-recorded. Often I'm frustrated by the lack of progress and by the obvious contradictions that I can sometimes hear in my own advice. You know, be authentic versus pretend to be confident, don't stand for it versus don't humiliate, you know, don't apologize all the time or undersell yourself or think you're an imposter. And the very part of my talk where I'm apologizing, underselling myself and telling you I'm an imposter. Nevertheless, when I sat down to plan what I wanted to say, I found that I do have some thoughts that I'd like to share and some things that I found have worked well. So I want to talk about some of the issues that you might have to deal with through the course of your career and the ways that I have found most effective to deal with them in a way that both fights for what I care about, but brings those around me on board. I almost always try to do so from a place of understanding. I like the idea that there's no such thing as irrational behaviour. I try to take a moment to understand why is someone acting the way they are and tackle it in a way that is productive and not just combative. So, getting on to the kind of issues that I think you see. I find it useful to think of these issues into three buckets: explicit, unintended microaggressions, and unconscious bias. The first bucket is the very explicit old-fashioned sexism from people who think that women just don't belong in construction. To be honest, I think that's pretty rare nowadays, and I haven't come across it much at all. If you do counter it, though annoying and upsetting, it's fairly easy to deal with, as more people around you will agree it's just unacceptable and they will back you up for not standing for it. But because it happens less and less, often people mistakenly take that as evidence that all is equal now and nothing more needs to be done. The second bucket is the unintended microaggressions. The "Dear Sir" on your email, the PPE that doesn't fit, the images of your workplace all being men. taken individually, they're pretty minor things and they're not a big deal. And it feels petty to be making a mountain out of a molehill, except that mountains are made out of molehills. And these things individually might be small, but cumulatively just give you the impression and send the message that maybe I don't belong here or this isn't for me. And so they are problematic and they need to be called out and dealt with. You know, these constant low-level signals just are an issue. When I was first made head of operations in construction, I was constantly in meetings, emails or discussions where the group would be addressed as like the lads or gents or men or boys. And nobody was doing it to try and give the message that I wasn't welcome, because I knew that I was. It's just a bad habit. It's almost like if I take my children to play at the house of a friend who has two girls and she says, "Come on, girls," to my boys, she's not trying to exclude them. It's just a habit because she's familiar with saying, "Come on, girls," to her girls. In the same way as the guys had 20 years of everyone in the room all being men. And so it was just a bad habit. But from the perspective of, you know, it's being a problem and needed to be addressed. When I first was made head of operations in construction, I was constantly in meetings, emails or discussions where the group was collectively referred to as lads, gents, boys. And so I constantly, politely pointed it out. So when they said, "Right then, lads," I would say, "And lasses." And they'll be like, "Oh, yes, of course." And for a little while, it got worse. They would remember to say it, but then they would look pointedly at me, kind of beaming and proud of themselves. They would say, "Right, come on then, lads, and lasses." It was just horrendous. It was much worse. But over time, it's just become a habit. And now we have, you know, a number of women working in the division, and now people are very used now to just addressing the whole room, and it's not an issue anymore. Now, they weren't ever trying to give the message that I wasn't welcome. It's no different than if I take my children to be at a friend's house who has two girls and she says, "Come on, girls," to a group that includes my boys. She's not saying they're not welcome. It's just a habit. But it was a habit that could do unintended harm, and it was a habit worth breaking, but breaking gently. Another story years ago, although not long enough for this to really be okay, I worked in an office that had girly calendars up on the wall, and I hated them. I really felt they were demeaning to women. They made me uncomfortable, and I felt uncomfortable kind of not doing anything about it. But also, I didn't want it to become a big battle against the guys who had them up. I didn't want to have to force them to take them down. You know, we had to work together. I want to be part of the team, and I actually like the guys. You know, I just didn't like their calendars. So I would constantly make jokes about the calendars. I would walk into that part of the office and I would say, "Oh, what year is it?" Because I thought it was maybe whatever year it was, 2005, but it appears to be 1972 in here. And gradually, although I never kind of tried to embarrass or humiliate everyone, they did get the message that maybe these posters were a little embarrassing and a little old-fashioned. And come January, nobody got a new calendar. The calendars were all gone. No one got a new one. But no one lost any face over it or was made to feel ashamed or embarrassed. The nice thing about the bucket of the kind of unintended microaggressors is that no one is really too offended if you point out that you're not a sir, or if you point out that the PPE in the stores doesn't fit. And so once you've spotted them, they're fairly easy to fix. You're not really kind of taking on too much of a challenge to point out that the PPE ought to fit the people on site. It's just really a matter of seeking them out and getting rid of them one by one, and doing so in a way that it doesn't need to be a huge battle and people don't need to be humiliated or embarrassed over it. The third bucket is not quite as easy to deal with as the first two. The third bucket is this just horrible big black fog of unconscious biases. They're hard to see, they're hard to point out, and they're hard to fix, but they are everywhere. Murray Edwards College have got a great piece of research worth a read called Collaborating with Men. The key insight from their research is that committing to gender equality means men actively working to change workplace culture as well. And it identifies 6 issues that many women experience. First is role congruence bias, and this is men who may benefit from the association between stereotypical views and leadership. The second is ability bias, which is the finding that men tend to be promoted on potential, whereas women tend to be promoted based on experience. And obviously you have potential a hell of a lot sooner than you have experience. That's a problem. The third is benevolent sexism. And this is kind of well-motivated people making decisions for women that damage their career. Like maybe Emma doesn't want to take on that project because she's just had a baby, or also holding back from giving clear feedback that you need to progress because maybe they just don't want to upset you. Language bias is men talking over or not hearing what women say, or anyone talking over and not hearing what women say. Performance evaluation bias is that double standard. Now, this is one that a lot of people, when I speak about, can identify with. So, for example, a loss of temper would be judged very differently in a man than a woman. If a woman lost her temper in a meeting and left the room, the people around the table are much more likely to say things like, oh, she's a psycho, or she's losing it, or she's on her period, and somehow the perception is that is all on her and she is weak and can't do her job. Whereas if a man loses his temper and leaves the room, people are much more likely to say, don't cross him, don't make him mad, like I wouldn't say that again. And the perception is much more that he's actually quite strong, quite tough, and he's someone that shouldn't be crossed. Both of them are kind of an inappropriate loss of control. Neither are really okay, but one is judged as weak and the other is judged as strong. And the final one is networking bias. And this is the finding that men's networks can sometimes sideline women, decisions on the golf course type networks. Now, I personally haven't found this one to be too much of a problem. And I wonder if it's maybe a one that is gradually reducing, but it's a one that was found to be a factor in their piece of research. I have less advice on the bucket of unconscious biases. A good starting point is to just be aware of them and making others aware. Somewhere I worked a few years ago held a number of workshops with Murray Edwards College. A survey was sent out and there was a workshop with the women, a workshop with the men, and then one with everyone together. And the thing that I found really eye-opening about this was that in the women's workshop, when the survey results were put up on the screen and they showed that women were experiencing more regularly being interrupted in meetings or ignored in meetings or not getting credit for their ideas, the women's room looked at the results and they kind of said, well, yeah, of course, but what can we do about it? Like, we know this, but what are we supposed to do about it? It's difficult. And the workshop focused on, well, what kind of things can you do about it? But the men's workshop, they put the results up on the screen and the men were like, no, that can't be right. What was the question? How are you analysing the data? Really questioning the validity of the data and really wanting to check on how the kind of statistical analysis had been done. Because, and these are smart, forward-thinking, good guys. They're not trying to deliberately uphold some kind of misogynistic advantage. They just had not witnessed this the way that the women in the business had, and it was news to them. And I really found that kind of was eye-opening to me, that realization that, of course, kind of we can't expect somebody to see something that they can't see. Very recently, I was talking to my boss about some feedback that I had that sometimes my peers find it hard to know what I'm thinking. And I was saying, I can't believe that. Like, I'm very open and expressive, and I make it very clear, what I feel and think. And he kind of pointed out, well, actually, that's not quite true. Sometimes they can see that I'm annoyed, but they really have no clue why I'm annoyed. And because they just don't have the experience that I have had of those issues. And so they can't see it in the way that I do. And he was right. Like, there maybe is something, particularly if it's around kind of equality or diversity in our company, where I am immediately seeing kind of the problem there, and then I'm annoyed that they don't share my view of the problem. But I'm wrong to be annoyed there. I need to take time to explain why am I judging it from this point of view. I'm expecting them to see something that they simply can't see. There's a lot to talk about in the research of the Murray Edwards College, in all those unconscious biases that I've just talked about, and more than I can cover in this one talk. But if we take meetings as an example, meetings are a place that decisions, where things get done, decisions are made. A lot happens in meetings in organisations. And there's at least two of the biases frequently going on in those meetings. One is the role congruence bias, where even from the start, if you don't maybe look like an engineer or you don't look like a managing director, then you're at a very minor but very small disadvantage that you need to kind of prove yourself. And the second one is the language bias. So there's a fantastic TED talk by Amy Cuddy. In fact, it's better than my talk. Pause this now and go and watch Amy Cuddy, or at least watch Amy Cuddy after this, around how body language and how your language kind of shapes who you are and shapes your message. And the use of that low power language that I certainly used to do, and I try to cut it out now, but I have to spot it in myself. That's saying things like, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I misunderstood the question, or I'm not sure if I'm right, but maybe it's this. I mentor quite a few women in the organization, and men as well, but the women in the organization quite often kind of struggle to be heard in meetings. And part of that is because they're saying things like, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the number's 4. They know for a fact the number's 4, but they're trying to be polite. But the guys in the room can be forgiven for hearing that maybe she's wrong. And the person next to her is saying that he definitely thinks the number is 5. And so they believe the person who says they're sure. They don't believe the person who says, I'm not sure, but it could be 4. The language you use, you do need to think about how that is, what is impact that's have on how much you're being heard. The second thing we're thinking about in a meeting is a good chair should spot people being interrupted or ignored or other people taking credit for their ideas. I think if an organisation really wants to begin to think about how do they ensure that people are heard equally and how women are able to advance in a business in a way that's purely merit-based, then doing training around how to chair a meeting is a really smart, easy first step, because a good chair of a meeting will make a big difference to the type of voices that are heard in your organisation. And the third thing for meetings that we did in the place I worked that did the Murray Edwards College workshops was almost made a pact to spot it for one another. At the time, one of the things that I found difficult to deal with was if somebody repeated something I just said and took credit for it, I felt like it was super petty to say, well, that was my idea. And I felt like it was really kind of not conducive to good teamwork and a good dynamic and a positive kind of meeting moving forward. And so I didn't feel able to do that. But equally, I was super frustrated when it happened. Like, that was my idea, and here's someone else getting credit for it. And so what we decided to do was spot it in one another, because although I always find it hard to say, that's my idea, I find it quite easy to say, well, yeah, that was their idea. When you point it out for someone else, you don't necessarily look petty. You can do it in a way that looks much more like you're just paying attention and you've listened to what everyone said and you're drawing people together. It doesn't need to be done in an aggressive way. You don't want to try and embarrass the person repeating the question. It's more just about drawing out the right credit. And finally, one of the things that I've learned relatively recently is that sometimes I'm talking to the wrong audience. I hope that the people watching this have found some useful things out of it, but it's no good for me just to be speaking to women in construction. I need to be speaking more to the men. The Murray Edwards College research found that they need men to be working on changing culture. And we still are in an industry where men are in leadership positions and they need to get on board. Last year, I ran a Women in Construction kind of full day event. We'd had quite a few women join the division fairly recently or join the company quite recently. And I wanted to understand, how was their experience of joining a business that hadn't been very good in the past of recruiting women and suddenly was getting quite good at it? Were we getting it right? Were we making sure we were going to retain these people? Were they getting the right level of support? And so we had this day, and the day was focused on looking at different types of research and looking at what things can we do as an organisation to just get better at this and make sure we're supporting our teams. And the attendees, I think, got a little bit out of it. But for me, the single biggest success of that day was that I asked the managing director of the Story Scotland division to open the day and to talk about why it was important and why were we bothering. And I think it's safe to say he was very worried about doing this talk. It's hard for him to get right. He can't say he understands without being accused that maybe he doesn't. had never spoken to a room of kind of 30 women all at one go before about a topic that he wasn't particularly well versed in, but genuinely did have a desire to improve and to learn. And so I sent him a few links. I sent him, the Sheryl Sandberg, Why Are We Too Few Women Leaders TED Talk. And I sent him a couple of articles, and he read them, and he spoke to colleagues, and he spoke to kind of a number of his peers. And for him, he really kind of saw the topic in a way he hadn't seen it before. He really delivered a fantastic opening for the day. He got the tone spot on. It was excellent. I tried to get him to come and talk at this with me, but he wasn't quite brave enough to be doing that just yet. But he really kind of said afterwards and said to me, he was like, I just haven't really looked at it in that way before. I just hadn't appreciated all these things that are happening. But like, of course, now that I see them everywhere. And I just thought, I've been talking to the wrong people. I've been kind of standing and talking just really at kind of women's networking events and mentoring young women and talking to the kind of junior women in our organisation around some of these issues. But I need to be speaking more frequently and more clearly to people who aren't engaging with it, not because they don't care, but just because they haven't looked at it from that perspective before. And so the final one of my commitments is going to be not just talking to people who want to hear me talk about this, but starting to talk a little bit more to people who maybe don't want to talk to me about this, and doing it in a way that I take my own advice and I'm fighting for the things I care about, but I'm bringing them on board. And I think that's really going to lead to bigger change than I've been able to achieve so far. I hope that even just beginning to engage with some of these things, and there's some other great talks during the course of this conference that go into some of these unconscious bias issues in more depth. I hope you take some actions and some interesting points away from this. I mean, even if it's only to watch the Amy Cuddy TED Talk. But I would like to make some commitments too coming out of this. So I want to make a point of, I found recording this very difficult. I don't particularly enjoy doing these kind of things, but I also despair at the lack of women leaders I see standing up and doing talks. And so I feel like I need to be, the whole be the change you want to see in the world. So I'm going to continue to speak up and be visible and try to make a difference, even if I'm not sure I've got all the answers. I want to kind of continue to try and push this forward and try and make a difference and be a visible force for good in the world. So enjoy the rest of the conference. I hope you've enjoyed this. I look forward to meeting some people in real life once that's allowed. Thanks. Bye.